Hello students, welcome to Social Studies digital classes. Today in our class, we are going to study about abolition of Zamindari system. Students, in your previous chapters, you have already studied about Zamindari system. Who were Zamindars? They were the recognized owners of the lands who were responsible for collecting rent from the peasants. Who were these peasants? They were the small farmers who work under zamindars and cultivate the land, pay rent to the zamindars. So, these peasants who were struggled a lot under zamindari system, who worked under zamindari system, they struggled a lot and demanded for the abolition of landlordism. So, through Kisan Sabhas, that also you learnt about in your previous chapters. Through Kisan Sabhas, these peasants wanted to and demanded for the abolition of this landlordism or zamindari system. So, in this chapter, we are going to learn about the abolition of zamindari system. Okay children, let us go further. By the end of this session, you will be able to learn about the rural poverty during the independence time, and you will respond to the situation of the poor people in those times. And you will be able to analyze the slogan land to the tiller, and you will be able to explain the effects of the abolition of Zamindari system and land reforms acts. Rural poverty at the time of independence. Children, when did our India got independence? In 1947. So, during that time, just before that, Second World War was ended. So, under Britishers rule, our Indians also participated in the Second World War, and because of that war, the conditions were very bad in our country. Most of the civilians participated in the war as soldiers, so that our agricultural production was reduced. So, due to the shortage of agricultural product, there was great famine which caused thousands of people died. So, due to this great famine occurred during that time. At the time of independence, there was a great poverty situations were there in our country. Newly formed Indian government, there was a big challenge to eradicate the poverty. So, when India became independent, our country was facing acute poverty, especially in rural areas. Rural means village areas. More than half of the rural population, that is 55%, were very poor, and there was no access to resources like land, education and employment. So, during that time, people were not having proper education, they are not having proper profession to earn the money, and they don't have the proper employment. Even a very large proportion of peasants were landless. The many peasants, they don't have lands of their own, they use it to work under the zamindars. They don't have their own lands to cultivate the crops, and there were hunger, famine and epidemics were frequent and devastating. Children, famine means there was shortage of food. As I already told you, the people, due to the Second World War, shortage of agricultural production, and that led to the poverty and famine. So, there was no food for the common people in the whole country, and that led to great famine in the country, which led to thousands of people death. What were epidemics? Epidemic means a contagious disease which spread even a whole country, like cholera. In those times, there were continuous epidemics were there, due to which thousands of people were killed. So, for a newly independent government, there was a big challenge or a problem to be solved was to eradicate poverty. To end the poverty, it was most important to give the poor access to the land for cultivation. So, it could be done by ending zamindari system or landlordism. Children, before Britishers arrived, our country was ruled by kings. So, the land was a major source of revenue, that is income for the kings. During this kingship, land was divided into jagirs. Jagirs means territory, allocated to jagirdars. These jagirdars split their land and allocated to subordinate zamindars. And these zamindars were given the rights to collect the rent from the peasants as tax. Here in this slide, you can see the picture of the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam, who was transferring the right of tax collecting to the British Empire. Students, in your previous chapters, you have already learnt Britishers introduced permanent settlement. What is permanent settlement? Look at this slide. Under permanent settlement, the peasants who were cultivating the land, they used to pay the tax to the zamindars, and these zamindars will collect the tax and pay to the British government. So, this was a permanent settlement introduced during the British rule. The zamindari system. The zamindars collected land revenue from the peasants. In return, they received a share of revenue collected, and the zamindars also owned lands on which the labourers worked. This was called their self-cultivated land or khud kast lands. Children, zamindars not only collecting the tax from the peasants, they also had their own lands which they had the labourers, and through that they used to get the more income. Those lands were known as khud kast lands. Peasants who were working under this zamindari system, who demanded that this landlordism or zamindari system to be abolished, they made request to the governments. Peasants wanted the government to reduce the taxes and free from stranglehold of the money lenders. Stranglehold means the complete power. So, the money lenders who they were having the complete power with them. So, these peasants they wanted to be free from the money lenders, and they also demanded for free from terror of the zamindars, and they also demanded that the land should belong to the peasant who actually tilled it. There is a slogan at that time was land to the tiller. That means the peasants they wanted to have the land of they ploughed. It should be the land should be with the peasant who actually ploughed it. So, let us see how the abolition of zamindari system took place step by step. The abolition of zamindari and other intermediary tenures. The law to abolish the zamindari system was passed in 1950s by all the state governments. Law means rule. In simple words, we can say it is an act or rule to abolish the zamindari system was passed in almost all the state governments in independent India, and also abolished all forms of forced labour like begar and vetti. Students, you learnt in your previous chapters that vetti system was there. Even in Telugu we say vetti chakiri, that means labour without wages. So, the peasants demanded for the abolition of this vetti. So, there was a law passed for vetti. There was a law passed to abolish vetti. This effectively ended the grievances of the rural masses. Rural masses means rural people. So, all these abolition of the laws made the people free from grievances. Grievances means complaints. To abolish this landlordism or zamindari system, the government identified the three major control of zamindars. Let's see what are they. Three types of control of landlords identified. First one, collection of land revenue. Revenue means income. So, the collection of land revenue, control over cultivated land and control over forest areas and waste lands. Let's go further. Land Reforms Acts. Laws were passed to end the system of revenue collection by zamindars. So, now peasants, they don't need to pay the tax to the zamindars, they can directly pay the tax to the government, no intermediaries. All landowners were to pay the taxes directly to the government. The government decided to compensate by lump sum payment. That means, when the peasants are paying tax directly to the government, not through zamindars, so for this, in turn, zamindars were given some compensation for this. Lump sum amount was given for them. But what happened, that is 20 to 30% of lump sum amount was given to the landlords or zamindars, which actually they used to get previously was more than 20 to 30% of their annual income. The lands of zamindars which were cultivated by recognized tenants was taken over by the government, and the tenants were declared as the owners of the land. Who were these tenants? These tenants who paid a sum price to the land and they were made the recognition owners of the land. So, by just paying some amount to the government, they were made pattadas of that land. So, these tenants, however, these tenants, most of the tenants, they could not pay even that small amount for the land and they were not recognized as the tenants, and they had to pay the tax directly to the government, not through any intermediaries. In this, nearly 2 to 2.5 crore tenants became the owners of the land they tilled. The zamindars would be the owners of their own khudkast land, which they cultivated directly either through sharecroppers or labourers. The zamindars retained most of the lands as they declared their tenants to be sharecroppers or labourers. Children, what happened here? So, when government said that the zamindar should not have that much of land with them, so the zamindar, they made even the sharecroppers and tenants and the labourers who were working under them, they retained the land with them. So, all this happened because of the Land Reform Acts did not set a limit for the land that a person could own. As per these new laws or the rules, the government took over the waste lands and forest lands held by zamindars. It could use for the development and redistribution to the poor people. So, whatever the lands they have taken from the zamindars, these lands were redistributed to the poor peasants who were not having lands of their own. Even the forest areas, waste lands were there, they were taken up by the government and given to the poor people. Next, about Jagirdar system. So, who were these Jagirdars? They were the feudal lords. You studied in your earlier chapters that under Jagirdars, Jamindars were there. Feudal system of land ownership is known as Jagirdar system. These were the officials who were given Jagir. Jagir means territory, a place, and responsible for collection of land revenue of that territory. In 1927, that means even before we got independence, forced labor or vetti had been abolished, but this law was not implemented successfully. However, this practice was put to an end in 1948 after we got the independence. Children, when did we got the independence? In 1947. But by that time, Hyderabad state was ruling by Nizams. It was an independent state. It was not merged with, merged means combined with, connected with the independent India. So, in 1948, so immediately after the merger of Hyderabad state, the Nizam issued a Farma. Farma means rule, order, abolished the Sarf-e-Khas. What is Sarf-e-Khas? That is personal Jagir, personal land given to the Jagirdars. That was abolished through this order. And even Vetti, the forced labor or the labor without wages, was also abolished. Here you can see the Hyderabad state before merging into independent India. Abolition of Jagirdar system. So, another Farman, that is another order, was issued on 15th August 1949 that Jagirs, even including the Samsthanams and Maktas, they were also abolished. This was a major step after independent India. Large Jagirs were taken over by the government and the land was given to the farmers to cultivate. Further, there was a reduction in the land tax. So, children, the Jagirdars who were having the lands with them, they were also taken away by the government and distributed to the poor people. And after that, the tax was reduced. Even another important step taken by the Indian government, a committee was appointed, Hyderabad Agrarian Reforms Committee. This committee recommended few steps to be taken by the government. Let us see what are they. First, removal of middlemen. So, this committee recommended that there should not be any middleman as in between the government and the peasants, and ceiling on the land ownership. Ceiling means not roof. So, ceiling means there should be some limit to the land ownership. In those times there was no limit for the landlords to hold the land. So, they used to have acres and acres, thousands of acres with them. So, there was no limit for that. So, this committee recommended that there should be some ceiling, that means there should be some limit for having or owning the land, and taking away surplus lands from the landlords. Surplus means extra, more than. So, the government should take the surplus extra land from the landlords. After the ceiling, the limit was fixed. After that limit, whatever the lands they were having, that should be taken away by the government. And protection to the tenants. These are the some important recommendations given by the committee to the government. However, not all these recommendations were implemented. Another important step was the famous Hyderabad Tenancy Act was passed in 1950, protecting all types of tenants, and all these tenants who were in continuous possession of the land for a period of 6 years were made protected tenants or patadars after a little payment. So, these tenants, after paying some little amount to the government, they were made the owners of that land. So, this new law was also taken up by the government. Similarly, the Hyderabad Inam Lands Abolition Act was promulgated in 1955. Inam means gift. So, by gift, those lands, whichever the lands the people used to get, on that also the government made a law. Okay children, that is all for today's session, but let us have a small recap what we have learnt in this session. Rural poverty at the time of independence. To end the poverty, it was the most important to give the poor access to the land for cultivation. And even you learnt about the slogan, land to the tiller. The land should be with the farmer who actually ploughed it. So, here is an activity for you children. You learnt about the permanent settlement, the hierarchy of land ownership, the hierarchy of land collecting land revenue. So, you need to make a flow chart of permanent settlement on a chart. This is an activity for you. and let us see some important questions relating to this topic. First question, who gained most and who did not gain at all? Do you think the landlords lost much? Children, you need to read the textbook and find out the answers for this. The second question, imagine that you are a tenant who got ownership over the land which the Land Reform Act was implemented. So, just imagine that you are a tenant and you got the ownership of the land. So, describe your feelings and actions at that time. Second question, imagine that you are a tenant who got ownership over land when the Land Reform Act was implemented. So, just imagine that you are a tenant who got the land ownership. So, describe your feelings and actions at that time. Third question, read the paragraph under heading Rural Poverty at the time of independence and answer this question. Have the conditions improved now and in what way? You learnt about during just after getting independence, what were the conditions of the poor people at that time. So, whether it is same even today or in what way it makes the difference. Let us see the Land Reforms Acts. First of all, the lands were passed to end the system of revenue collecting by the Jamindars. All the landowners were paid taxes directly to the government. Since the Jamindars would lose this source of income, the government decided to compensate them by lump sum payments. This compensation was about 20 to 30 times more than annual income. The lands of Jamindars, which were cultivated by recognized tenants, were taken over by the government and tenants were declared the owners of the land. They had to pay tax directly to the government, not through any intermediaries. When the government found that it had spent a lot of money in paying compensation to the Jamindars, it made a rule that the tenants would be given land only if they paid some price for it. Those peasants who could pay became the owners of the land and were freed from the burden of the landlord system. In this way, about 2 to 2.5 crore tenants benefited and became the owners of the land they tilled. However, hundreds of thousands of poor peasants could not pay the price or did not have legal recognition as tenants. The law also said that the Zamindars would be owners of their own khudkast land, which they cultivated directly either through sharecroppers or labourers. This provision actually enabled the most Zamindars to retain control over most of the lands, as they declared their tenants to be sharecroppers or labourers. They also evicted a large number of tenants to take over their lands for self cultivation. They used various loopholes in the law to retain control over large portion of land. This was because the Land Reforms Acts did not set a limit to the amount of land a person could own. For better understanding of the concepts, please solve the worksheets given for you and please visit the official site SCERT. That is all for today's session, children. That is all, children, for today's session, and we will meet in the next session with more interesting topic and steps taken by the government to abolish the Zamindari system. Thank you.
First question. Bhilai steel plant was built in collaboration with option A, West Germany, option B, USSR, option C, Canada, option D, USA. Your time starts now. The correct answer is option B, USSR. Next question. The interference of the government is very limited in option A, socialist economy, option B, capitalist economy, option C, mixed economy, option D, all of these. Your time starts now. The correct answer is option B, capitalist economy. Next question. Who is the custodian of country's foreign exchange reserves? Option A, RBI. Option B, both RBI and SBI. Option C, SBI. Option D, Finance Ministry. Your time starts now. The correct answer is option A, RBI. Next question. The basic regulatory authority for mutual funds and stock markets lies with the option A, Reserve Bank of India, option B, Government of India, option C, Securities and Exchange Board of India, option D, stock exchanges. Your time starts now. The correct answer is option C, Securities and Exchange Board of India. Next question. Both private and public sectors exist side by side in option A, China, option B, USA, option C, India, option D, Russia. Your time starts now. The correct answer is option C, India. Next question. World Bank provides for option A, short term, option B, long term, option C, both short term and long term, option D, medium term. Your time starts now. The correct answer is option B, long term.